I got introduced to Agile in college as a theory, as like a conceptual thing. It's kind of like just the general set of like processes that we use. Setting up like practical, responsible development practices that actually work. Not just like in the code itself, like the craft, but another part of it was like, hey, what do we need to do as engineers to work together effectively? And what is a Scrum Master? A Scrum Master is the person whose job it is to enforce or to help the team adhere to the Agile process. And not just the engineers, but like everyone on the team, the product owner. So in Agile, you have kind of like the product owner, and we all, no matter what, are always a little bit of the product owner, which is, Agile is incomplete, right? It's like Agile says that there's one product owner, which would be great, but that's just never true. The Scrum Master is, on the other hand, sometimes it's the same person, usually not, because usually they're at least coming from a technical background. May not be the same technologies, may not be this like totally relevant to what you're building, but generally they have like, they believe in Agile, they believe in like, hey, you can't plan things ahead of time. It's like a counterintuitive truth, right? Like the world is not flat, and neither can you like just throw an app together real quick and plan it out ahead of time, and it's gonna have chat. That's all you need to know. Everyone does that though, unfortunately, because that's the intuitive, easy thing to do. So the Scrum Master understands that's not the case, and the Scrum Master understands that like to be successful, this process works, and that if you iteratively develop, you're going to have better outcomes than if you try to like cram something down everybody's throats or like build a plan ahead of time and then execute on the plan later. Specifically, the Scrum Master is the one that says like, this is the retrospective. I'm reminding you about what this meeting is. We're going to ask 3 questions. The first question is, etc. And then on stand-ups, to remind everybody, a stand-up is where we talk about what did we do today, etc. So they're kind of like, I don't know, the conductor. It's all a jazz band, for sure. Conductor is the Scrum Master, the composer is the product owner, and then the musicians are the engineers. But it's a jazz band, and it's constantly freestyle. Nice. Here they call it a facilitator. Sometimes they scream out. Yep. Facilitator. So Scrum is the stand-up. Because really that responsibility at the end of the day falls on the product owner. So like if the wrong decisions are being made, like pointing your finger and blaming a bunch of engineers, while easy because they're a group, is not like really the right way to conduct yourself, right? So really the product owner's job is to take responsibility for anything that goes wrong, and conversely anything that goes right. Protecting the team from outside distractions. I've never found that to be something that a Scrum Master actually did in like a formal Scrum Master setting. Sometimes you'll hear them called project manager, like, or PJM. So PJM, project manager. Sometimes at a higher level, program manager. That's the Scrum Master role. And compare that with like PM or sometimes PDM, which is product manager. Do you guys understand the difference between a project manager and a product manager? The product manager is playing the role of like, I'm taking care of the product. Like, I'm not managing people, I'm managing the products. Really owning the products, defining like requirements. And the extent to which they do that is usually a function of how technical they are and how experienced they are. The most usual problem is that there just won't be a product manager at all. And then if there is one, usually it's someone who ended up in the role without ever having done it before or without sufficient technical understanding. Sometimes they do. So it is possible to be a great product manager, and even the people that are inexperienced usually like really earnest and are doing their best in the role, and like sometimes can add a lot of value. Project manager is the Scrum Master, and usually they're not the same person. Something to remember about Agile is that everybody kind of does it differently. It's broad, and so because it's broad, you can kind of like do it however you want. and everybody thinks they're doing it like the right way. So anyways, that's the history of Agile. Is frankly, I don't know. There was this thing called the Agile Manifesto. A bunch of people signed it, and it was kind of like it was happening at a time where everyone I think was really fed up with like how shitty it was to be an engineer and make stuff. Like, what are we? You know, the business is like, what the fuck are we doing? Like, we have all these people, and they're like our most expensive line item, but we don't really understand what's going on. And a lot of the reason for the adoption comes down to that, especially at bigger companies. It's about like, I need to justify like my spending, and I need to be able to see something tangible that's happening, especially once you're, you know, getting bigger and bigger and bigger. It's like you're dumping more and more money, and it's like having less and less of an effect because you've hired so many engineers, which is like that's a separate problem.
At least like gives the illusion of everybody being on the same page.
It has the promise of making the business aware of what everybody's working on, and it has the promise of making your whole development effort more effective by allowing you to like streamline the flow of work, etc. In the same way, like if you're on an assembly line, you might be able to like look high level at what's going on and try to like optimize the assembly line to be more effective, which is a great idea in theory, but Agile by itself does almost nothing for that. Like Agile, I think doesn't even really like the whole way we use Trello and the way we like move things between those lists. Like I don't even think that concept really comes from Agile per se. I think that comes from like the idea of a Kanban board. But it's kind of become lumped into this idea of Agile because again, everybody learns this thing in practice, and that's what they see when they use Agile. Why Agile is especially worth it for us as a development shop. But some of the religious adherence that we have comes from that because like we don't exactly know why it works. I have some theories now after having like dissected the product management process a little bit more. I think the thing about Agile that was like really important for the satisfaction of our stakeholders was the daily communication. And that was probably the biggest day-to-day difference from what we were doing before. Especially, you know, being remote or being like, honestly, even if you don't have to be remote, even if you're working with a client locally, like most of the time, if you're running your own shop, you're going to be remote. And a lot of time, even just in a job, you'll end up being remote. So I think the learning from that was like, it's super important to every day talk to the person who is going to be paying you or as close as you can get. Or the person, if not the one paying you, the person who's like responsible for your review or evaluating your performance. What are user stories? It's the idea of a certain kind of task, I guess, but structured in a way where, you know, as a role, insert role here, I have the desire to do X. Presumably through this tool, and like it gets pretty broad, so like, you can kind of run with it any direction. Like what it seeks in theory, or at least what you're taught when you read and learn about Agile, is that the theory is like you have people that want to achieve something. Like you can think about the meeting that we had yesterday. I think it was yesterday, where we did the AMA style meeting, and we got feedback from everybody across this organization. And then like sometimes people will bring up suggestions for features, like we need to be able to have the sales IQ integration, and they just leave it at that, right? So one is like if you force this structure, it does a pretty good idea. It does a pretty good job of helping people like give you better information or give you more information, because you're at least knowing like, okay, as this kind of user, like as a customer or a user, at the very least, just as a user, right? It structures the way that you present the task so that you're focused on what somebody wants to do, a desire of someone that wants to use your tool, your software, as opposed to like an implementation detail. And a lot of times, like the people that are suggesting feature requests, like almost always there's something real and valuable at the heart of it, but it's easy to get distorted because in the process of them trying to help or trying not to look stupid or trying to like basically them trying to do it on their own before they talk to you about it, they get a little of the way there and they come up with something that starts to make less and less sense, especially when you play a game of telephone across an organization. So I think like I don't know how well the user story goal actually works in practice because I personally have had a hard time getting people to stick to doing it. I think probably because it sounds a little silly and it's labeled stories, which doesn't really make you feel like you have this razor sharp. Yeah, you feel more like you're like a kindergarten teacher.
Yeah.
Not that there's anything wrong with that. We should really work with more of those. Life would, in a lot of ways, be better. But you feel more like a kindergarten teacher and less like a seasoned business executive, unfortunately. So I don't. It's a great idea, but I haven't ever really been able to be super successful with it. It is even great though for yourself. If you find yourself just trying to take a quick note and you're like, what is it that I'm like actually trying to communicate right now? And then you can always go dump all your ideas about how you might go about it, you know, in the Trello card or Jira story, whatever. But I think the idea is to keep it focused on like what somebody wants to do. And the reason it's not needs, the reason it's wants is just because I think, as we can all probably relate to, when you're told like we need to do this or this needs to work this way, there's like immediately like this shame or this guilt that like somehow you were responsible for this, like somehow this is your fault, or like somehow even if you don't necessarily agree, you're a bad person. Whereas like if it's a want, it's like this user wants to do that. That's not personal. It's nothing that you overlooked. It's like who would have thought that someone would want to do this? And they're not necessarily going to get it either because these user stories don't necessarily get worked on. So I think it helps keep in the mind of the requester or the reporter, it helps them maybe realize that they're not like necessarily going to get this thing that they're asking for. Again, all that would be great if it actually worked. It's really hard to get people to adhere to that structure.
It can also just kind of like make you realize that like, oh, users don't want to do that at all. Like, why are we doing this?
Yeah, that's very
like,
true.
It's more like as the
business.
The business, I want the users to have to do this.
Right. Right. So it's almost like a user story is a good crutch, maybe, if you're finding yourself having a hard time trying to train people to write stories like this. My experience has not been super effective, but it can be a good tool for like teasing out the meaning from someone's requests, or helping them think about things in a more productive way. Last I checked, I guess like circa 2019, there was a big emphasis on being customer-centric or user-centric. And like not even just in development, like just for as a startup in particular. And the whole idea of like, okay, now we have customer success teams to capture the fact that like startups are really going above and beyond with customer support by default. Like that's the talking to your users. It's not just about supporting them and making them enthusiastically satisfied, although that's like really important to getting repeat business. It's also just about opening up that line of communication and letting that impact your product in a positive way, so that you're actually making what people want to use, as opposed to just making what you think they want to use or making whatever you feel like. So some of Agile is actually tapping into the same thing by giving the business an idea of like what's actually getting worked on. The visibility of that work gives us the confidence to be able to say that like, hey, yeah, no, everything that we've done is in there, and everything that we've delivered to you is there. If you choose to audit it at any time, you can. So I think it helps a little bit with like us having the confidence to self-direct a little bit more. And it also, like, I guess traditionally in Agile, there's this idea of like a developer can pick a story to work on out of any of the stuff that's been brought into the sprint. And we don't do that as much here per se, because we're a lot more hands-on as far as like guiding, splitting up the work into tasks that can be given to people at varying skill levels, which is kind of a different approach a little bit. And that goes a little bit beyond Agile. Although it is a little bit more in the DevOps world. So whenever you hear DevOps, like DevOps is in and of itself like a kind of a movement too, right? Different, which people define in many different ways. But yeah, so like Agile, I think Agile is kind of hinting at those same ideas. It's hinting at the DevOps movement. It's hinting at the user-centric design movement. Have you guys heard of the term hallway usability testing? Hallway usability testing is this idea where like, okay, you want to build a feature, or you've already built a feature rather, like you can learn a lot about it. Like one substitute for going out and talking to users or doing a survey, right, is just to literally go into the hallway and ask somebody else, hey, can you just like try this real quick and tell me whether it sucks a lot or only a little bit. But if the idea is if you can get somebody to like successfully be able to use it internally, that's something. And honestly, it's a heck of a lot better than even today what happens at a lot of companies. That was a word that came around in the Agile movement. What is a stand-up?
The rugby scrum in the beginning of the match. Review how everybody's doing, what the game plan is, keep everybody on track with the game.
Yeah, keeping everybody on track. So why do we do a stand-up?
It's almost like a stimulation for the day, like to kind of stimulate the plan, make sure it's real clear with everybody. And
facilitate communication, right? Yeah, because it stimulates, like, because otherwise you're going to get into the office, you'll start working on something, or you'll get sucked into like a series of Slack messages. And that moment that you miss at the beginning of the day to talk is important, not just for like getting paid, like we talked about before, if you're working on a contract. That's an important piece for sure. But it's about just talking to each other. So if let's say that we're having a stand up, and then John mentions that like, oh yeah, like yesterday I worked on I don't know, this new PDF, and I'm like, if I didn't know that, then now I'm in the loop. And the idea is that everybody in the team kind of gets in the loop about what got done to the product as a whole. Which is really just kind of a substitute for if you were building the whole thing yourself, you would know what got done. But because you're not, you have to the Borg has to communicate with each other somehow.
Yeah, it could reduce that phone call game. People are just passing down messages, or messages are getting lost in translation. It helps at least clarify or correct like definitions and things like that.
And specifically, that's the question and blockers part, right? So like for the stand-up, it's like we have accountability, I guess, first and foremost. We have forced communication. So that's kind of just in general is forced communication. Accountability is the first question. What did you do yesterday? And if so, at the a lot of the appeal of stand-up for a lot of organizations is just that, hey, this is a way for us to do not necessarily a status check on the project, although that can happen too a lot of times, which can be really fucking annoying. Because that's not what it's really supposed to be for, and it makes you waste a bunch of time trying to explain the status of the project again to someone when it's irrelevant, right? Like it doesn't matter. That's not what the meeting's about. But what the benefits it has is forced communication. It's accountability. It forces you to be able to say, what did I do yesterday? So not even just accountability for like, did I work enough hours or whatever, but like, did I work on something that I can like openly explain, or did I spend the entire time deciding, like, first of all, finding out what different symbols are legal in JavaScript variables, and then combining those symbols into different complicated JavaScript variable names. Like if I spent my entire day doing that, then I know that at the stand-up I'm going to have to sort of quickly come up with an excuse as to why I didn't have anything else that got done. So it keeps you kind of on track. And then similarly, saying what are you going to do today? It's like it keeps you on track, sure, but it's also like a way to force you to do some personal planning. Like, what are you going to do today? So it's a way to make everybody be their own project manager. A lot of the stuff that we do, that Rachel and I do for you guys here, is stuff that a lot of places you would have to do yourself, as far as subtasking out. Like, okay, like what do I need to do first? Like you're going to do little microarchitecture all the time. Because it's really, really rare that you have someone that is managing you that is technical, is both technical and aware of the technologies, and like spending the time to actually deeply understand what you're working on, which sucks. It's really unfortunate because it means that it can be hard to grow. Because a lot of times the people that you're reporting to are not the people that can be good mentors to you. You join the team, you have a manager, and you have a mentor. And the mentor is like a peer, because presumably the manager can't be that peer for you, or they can't be that mentor for you, really. Not on the actual coding side. Not going to be true everywhere, but that has been true everywhere that I've ever worked or seen. Except maybe Proxy. I bet if you work for them, but even if you were working for Proxy on the Sails app, then yeah, your manager wouldn't be able to help you as much even. So I think it quickly happens probably because technology changes so much, or it provides an opportunity to ask questions and get real-time answers, or to at least to delegate the work of the non-technical work of finding out the answer to someone else like your Scrum Master. In theory, that works. In practice, it doesn't always work either, because your project manager is going to be the least technical person and oftentimes will just go and play the game of telephone themselves instead of you playing it, and it turns out they're like a lot worse at it, which sucks. And then they might warp what you're asking into something else.
Oh, yeah.
So that's kind of, that part of it is, yeah, it's better in theory. In practice, it doesn't really per se work. To go back into being in theory, like if you were to ask a question, you can't get a real-time answer right there in the meeting. Like ideally the product owner is, and this is part of Agile, okay, like officially, like the product owner is supposed to be educated enough about the product and empowered enough to make decisions on behalf of the business related to the product that they should be able to answer like almost all of your questions about requirements right there in the meeting. So, and that part, if you truly have that person that can make that call, that can be awesome. As soon as it's going to the project manager, to the Scrum Master, usually that's where things fall apart, because that person has no more context than you do to be able to get the answer. And the fact that the product owner is not jumping in and doing it is kind of its own problem. It's like, why not, right? Why isn't the product owner doing that? Because their job is to make sure that the developers have the answers they need. So I'm just going to write down the product owner, actually, not the Scrum Master. And I'll even put or an apprentice, because I think a lot of what you guys do for us is not necessarily when it's a question about requirements, although sometimes y'all ask questions for me and Rachel all the time, which is one of the many reasons y'all can add so much value without necessarily having as much experience right away. Because like you have the communication skills, you have the professionalism, and you have the time basically to be able to take care of those tasks that you're going to need to practice anyways, but that we we'll either want to avoid because we'll get sucked into a longer conversation with the person we're asking, or just we would end up thinking about all of the different times we've encountered this before, right, and have developed this sort of like trap of wisdom that will suck us in and get us to spend an hour writing an email that should take 5 minutes, right? So you guys have fresher minds in that way, and it can make it more efficient for you to do tasks. What is a sprint review and what is a retrospective? Sprint review, for us, it's always been a demo session, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the same thing as the demo session. So here they're defining the sprint review as like being the combination of the demo session and then the retrospective.
The retrospective, it may sometimes get underestimated at how significant it can be, but helps to get out some of the hardest things people are holding back with the project, and they just get it off their chest at the end. It's a nice way to wrap it up.
Yeah, I agree. A retrospective is 3 questions. It's what went well, what didn't go so well, and then what might we try next time. But the reality is, like, the things you talk about in a retrospective is just as much like it's about being like copacetic and like giving you a way to vent in some ways, helping build trust by letting everyone be vulnerable with each other, which helps just with the team dynamics in general. And I feel like, yeah, that to me is like 90% of the value of the retro. And it can make you aware of issues you weren't aware of before, but like honestly, you're gonna fucking forget anything you talk about. In my life, I forget almost everything I do almost every day. So with the retro, it's like if you can help build vulnerability and trust with each other, then you're going to be more likely to bring up, hey, you know what? Like the way you're doing that in there in that file is causing some problems, and you're going to like be able to say that without worrying. So I think that's the real value of the retro, like a safe place. Basically, it's team building. So what's a planning meeting? I call it sprint planning. This is going to be this is worth talking about because it's something that'll come up. So something worth pointing out is that it is not super well defined, like what that meeting is, or if it's even a meeting at all. So I guess really a better question is like, what is sprint planning? So if you're ever getting called out, or you got some idiot that wants to joust with you about how much of Agile you know and how legit you are, like the first thing, for tip number 1, or like here, I'll just put this: how to joust with someone about Agile. Tip one, don't engage. Like,
Yeah.
just try to like make it so that your hands are in the air and you're like, hey, I did Agile. I know, as you know, everybody does Agile a little bit differently. And I did Agile, I've done Agile at one place, or I've done Agile at 2 places, or I've done Agile at 23 places, if you want to really kind of rub it in their face. But I see, so I'm not really sure when we talk about Agile, it can mean a lot of things. Tell me more about how you think about Agile. And flip it around. That's how I would address it.
It's like tread lightly when they say like, I know the way to do Agile, and maybe they even acknowledge there's multiple ways, but they're like, I know the way. Like, it's just
right.
Yeah. So what is your way?
And that's probably fair in our world in software development. Anyone who says that talks about the way to do anything is already like a little bit suspect.
Yeah.
Including us, including the sales framework when we have our own convention over configuration stuff. It's like it's not that necessary. That's not that it's the only way. And honestly, like a lot of it there's things that I would change if I could go back. But realistically, it's like you have to pick a way at some point, and like it's easy if there was like if we had the sales Agile TM that told you exactly how to do Agile, then you could talk about that, right? But just keep in mind anytime they talk about Agile, or they talk about like, oh, the way you go to production, as if it's like a standard thing. Everybody's is slightly different, and anybody who says differently they don't know what they're talking about, or they've only worked at one place ever. So other concepts that were introduced to me: extreme programming. Extreme programming! Basically, the thing about extreme programming is just when you hear it, think pair programming. That's like the main thing about extreme programming, which really taps into something that we've tapped into here, which is that developers, you hire more of them, you don't get the stuff done faster. You get a bunch of crazy piles of shit everywhere. So like, it's not working just throwing more people at the problem. We need a better way. Extreme programming was saying, like, what if we took 2 developers and put them on the same computer? Because it's not like they get more done when there's 2 of them anyway. And at least if there's 2, then someone will catch the problems. And so I think that's kind of evolved into the modern approach to pairing. It's still like pairing is inherently can be wasteful, and like because of the nature, you have 2 people doing the same task, even if just to keep you on task. Because at a certain point, if you're getting hung up with blockers over and over and over again, you can't move forward. Having someone else there with you to suffer is at least like therapeutic.
Can pairing go beyond just 2 people, like in this particular context?
Tripling?
Yeah, like tripling, or I was thinking like
swarming. I've heard
swarming.
Well, so something to think about with pairing is like you always have someone that's going to be driving, and then you have sort of like your passenger. Mm-hmm. Because even if you had like multiple people with a mouse, it would be like a lot. And I'm saying that right now, I'm not really knowing. That might be possible.
Is to like go up to somebody like
right.
this
and like slide your hands. So yeah, you have like a driver, you have a passenger, or whatever. You usually don't say passenger, but there's like the driver who's doing the driving. Usually I guess the thing to know about this concept is that you want the less experienced person to be driving whenever possible. In practice, it's hard to do that because sometimes pairing, especially for y'all, it'll be about like, hey, half of the reason I'm doing this is so that you'll have the opportunity to see this for the first time.
They'll say like, oh, no, type this. Like, oh, no, wait, sorry, there's like a dash before it.
Which is important to suffer those pains, because then you guys learn, like when someone says like, all right, rimraff it, you understand what the fuck rimraff means.
Yeah.
And and I'll have to, or like if someone says, all right, now type git pull, you're going to type GIT instead of GET. So some of that like verbal communication stuff is helpful that you get out of pairing, and forcing the person with more experience to be distant, like forces them to like verbalize the stuff, and it forces you to be able to comprehend. The next level up is if you can't really fit 3 people around the computer in the same way, or if you do have 3 people, the dynamic is getting pretty crowded. So like I would say the next thing would be just like make it the live code, where you just like go and you're like presenting, or like we do a lot of times where we'll just like one person will be showing how to do something, like giving a talk. So I think that's the way it normally goes after 2 people, or it'll be you'll hear a lot like swarm or problem. I heard that a lot at Walmart, where like everybody, and that's like less about being productive at getting something like a feature built, and more about just like what do? We got to get everybody in the same room so we can just cut past the bullshit of like, I talked to this person, but they're on vacation, or like I sent an email and this person hasn't responded for 3 days, but like the entire system's offline, right? Or we're gonna to use an example from the Phoenix project, like we're gonna pay. We don't actually know how much to pay everyone in the company, and payroll's tomorrow. Like let's swarm the problem. Oh my God, what do we do? How do we mitigate the issue, etc.? Why we call it an estimation and not an estimate? Why we call the act of assigning a point value to a task? Why we call that an estimation or a pointing? No one ever wants to call it an estimate. In Agile, the theory is that you're supposed to think of these points as levels of effort, or LOE, as you'll hear in enterprise settings. And like that level of effort is not supposed so it's not supposed to be time. It's not supposed to be the way we do it. It's not supposed to be purely time oriented. It's supposed to be an estimation of like how hard is it really to do it. It's a combination of the time and how hard it is. I forget the reason for that, but a lot of the reason people avoid the word estimate is because they're trying to separate, like they don't want story points to be tied to like hours. They don't want them to be tied to dollars. They want them to be their own thing. And they want them to go through natural inflation and deflation as a team grows over time. If you hire a bunch of less experienced people and like you replace a bunch of your team, first of all, no one's going to know what's going on because it's all new to them and everyone else probably just left. But like it's going to change, like what, how hard it is to do something will change. And so I think they're thinking, the framers of the Agile Manifesto, their thinking was that like, it's better to have the points change than it is for people to like pad their estimates or anything like that. And people can feel embarrassed, or like people don't necessarily want to admit that like, oh, that's going to take you 3 days. Like no one wants to have that conversation. But that can happen regardless, and that's kind of where we landed with it with the time thing, is that it's easier to just keep it more tied to some single step abstraction from amount of time contributed, like man hours, I guess. And then just to solve the other problem, just kind of to avoid letting people say stuff like that and get away with it. Because at the end of the day, if someone says that is that really going to take 3 days? Like that's an incredibly mean thing to say to someone, and not like that's not the culture you want to have on your team. Planning poker. Do you guys understand what planning poker means? What we do during an estimation session where we count off and then we say the number, that's planning poker. Because it's poker in that you're not revealing what your estimate's gonna be until everybody has revealed what their estimate is, with the idea of not influencing each other's estimations.
Interesting.
And without, there's all the like the guilt, all the shame, or like all the arrogance, whatever it is that, could be misread from your estimation, and someone could like hear and understand. You want to try to avoid that, and I think that has value. I think it's had value for us. I would say though that like it's overly emphasized, and a much better predictor of how accurate your estimations are going to be is like what you're estimating. Like, are you estimating things that are not ready to be estimated? So one other thing about that, the point system. So you'll hear like people talk about a Fibonacci sequence. And so in the Fibonacci sequence, you'll hear it, the things you'll hear it in reference to in software development, there's 2 things. One is you'll hear it in reference to teaching recursion. So if you're going to teach someone how to do recursion, a lot of times they'll use the Fibonacci sequence as an example. Because you can write your function as a recursive function and implement a thing that does the Fibonacci sequence. The other thing you'll hear in reference to Fibonacci is the point system in Agile. And the only reason that's mentioned is because a lot of times the point systems will be the Fibonacci sequence. Like what matters of that, as far as like being able to communicate it and understand it, is that the reason why we use that sequence or something like it is because that way the numbers that are bigger are further apart. And so a bigger task is harder to estimate. It's going to be less accurate. What a product owner is. In practice, it's usually everyone, but it is that one person who has that has the authority to make decisions. Importantly, at least in Agile, that's kind of the definition. They need to be empowered to make decisions, and they need to, ideally they're an expert on the products, but being empowered to make decisions is kind of the same thing. So they're the decision maker about what does or doesn't go in the product, and they're sort of bridging the gap between technology and the business. All right, planning poker.
Planning poker is like a strategy for the estimation session. Have people not influence each other as much as possible with their estimations, different tasks to take on.
Avoiding influencing each other. All right, Rachel, what is a user story?
It is a way of like wording requirements as kind of like how the user should interact with it or like experience it. It's like as an agent, I want to be able to type in my license ID or my email address to log in.
Perfect. Madison, hallway usability testing.
The idea that if you can get some random person off the street to successfully figure out how to use the thing that you're making, then you're probably doing all right.
Yep, perfect. Product manager, or if you ever see PDM or PM.
I guess it seems similar to like a product owner, but it's just somebody that's like more engaged with the actual, like, I guess the engineers and just people involved with the project.
You're on the right track. There's not even a difference between this and the product owner in most cases.
Okay.
I think that the product manager is a role that exists in a lot of companies. If you'll see a product owner role on like LinkedIn, that happens. But that's usually at more like enlightened organizations that have decided to, or people who have really embraced Agile and want to use that as like their role.
Oh, okay.
The ladder, the career ladder, is kind of like product manager, senior product manager. I don't know how this will stick or not, but right now a lot of times you'll see like staff or principal product manager. You'll see head of products, director of products, chief product officer. It's that kind of like, but it's that ladder, those levels. You're kind of always sandwiched in between business and technology. Mm-hmm. And if you're a technical product manager, you're probably a very good product manager. Yeah. Rachel, what's a Scrum Master?
The Scrum Master is the person who runs the Agile meetings.
Right. They help with adherence. What is Scrum? Madison.
That's the set of things that make up the process.
Good guess, and literally before today, that's what I would have said, given the rugby origin. Scrum is talking specifically about like the stand-up. And I think you could kind of lean in between that and it being a huddle, being the stand-up. Sprints. John, what's a sprint?
A way to encapsulate all the project, or at least pieces of projects in a timeline sort of fashion. Like it kind of gives you like a timeline to slap everything onto for a moment.
Yeah. Yep. It makes it discrete. No longer will time be continuous. A sprint makes it so that even if you can't get your shit together and have key dates, right? Like you can't identify when this needs to go out because everything just needs to be a priority or just whatever. It's a way of like quickly plugging in, hey, now we have a time frame. Mm-hmm. Like now we have due dates. Now we have some amount of accountability because we can say we make commitments, mm-hmm. and then the business can use that for planning. If you take pretty much everything we've talked about and you remove sprints and you make it so just the same process goes on, I don't remember if you estimate or not. You might not estimate, but let's say you're estimating everything's the same except there's no sprint. Mm-hmm. You're just always pulling off work. I think that's Kanban. So if you ever hear people talking about Kanban, there's a concept of a Kanban board, which is just those swim lanes, like a Trello board, that like layout of presenting shit, basically. And then Kanban as a process is like pretty much just Agile without the sprints. Rachel, what's the retrospective?
The retrospective is, well, we normally do it as part of the sprint review, but it's like its own little meeting where you say what went well, what didn't go so well, what we could do better.
At the end of the sprint. And that's perfect. Madison, what are story points?
So that's a value that's assigned to a task that tries to encapsulate the complexity of the task.
Yep, and I would agree with that definition. If you found someone who did want to give you an Agile joust, let's say it was a rogue interviewer, what word might you use instead of complexity? So definitely not hours, definitely not business value, and definitely not dollars. But effort is the word that people like to cling to. But yeah, effort. You're right. Complexity is like it's almost it. It's just people talk about effort. It's like what's the number of sweat drops that this will take?
It's like the power output. Yeah.
Yeah, what power will it take from you? Like, 'cause I guess maybe it's coming from a place of like this task is exhausting. Yeah, it only take me an hour, but I'm not gonna want to work again for the rest of the day if I do this fucking shit one more time. You know, like honestly, if you're reading an article about like what are story points or whatever, like one of the first things you'll see in there always, and it gets like repeated around again, probably with everyone, including me, not fully understanding why, what the motivations are. Like, they will say that it's not the amount of time it will take; it's the amount of effort in italics. And so just because that word is so commonly thrown around, it's good to be aware of it. John, what's a program manager? A pajam.
The pajam project manager having a similar acronym.
But think about like, I'll give you a hint. It's not, product manager is categorically different. Because the product manager is managing a product. Whereas the program manager is managing
only the program itself, or
exactly the process, the program, the engineering program here. Like,
Okay.
what does our organization do as a process? Program manager is the same as project manager. And you might like PJM might not be shown for program manager. I just put that there to kind of help y'all see visually.
I see.
Some people will be project managers and called program managers. And then just program manager, project manager? What's another name for the role they play in an agile process-based organization?
Scrum manager.
Scrum Master, exactly.
Scrum Master. Yeah.
They are the Scrum Master. They may be doing other things. It's just it's the same relationship that product manager has to product owner.
Okay.
So product owner is to product manager, as Scrum Master is to program manager / project manager. And the only thing I would throw out there is that a lot of times there'll be another role called the software engineering manager, or the engineering manager, or your line manager, you'll hear it called. There's your HR manager. They're the person who's like in charge of hiring and firing. In software engineering, that person is supposed to be more adept with software. They're supposed to be more technical. Whereas the project manager and the program manager, they don't really need to have relevant technical experience and be up to date. But the engineering manager is always expected to have relevant technical experience, and it's expected to be able to like slip in as the lead developer if needed, ideally, in an ideal situation. So that one you'll hear called an SEM, or software engineering manager. The last thing to point about program manager is like it is the same as project manager, just project, program, same fucking thing. It's all about the process. Really, it should be called like process manager, or like agile manager. If you have a program manager and a project manager, chances are the program manager is the project manager's boss. So then what's the product owner, Rachel?
As the person who signs off on what's delivered, or like they're responsible for like saying yes, like this was delivered, or like no, this wasn't successful.
That is true. They're also empowered to do what requirements.
They are empowered to make decisions on behalf of the business.
Exactly. Even if that decision is accepting the work, right? Or whatever.
Or like even if that decision is saying like, I'm not gonna bring this back to anybody. I'm just gonna. I think this is the right move. I'm gonna go with that.
Yep. Perfect. Madison, what is Agile?
The whole bundle of all of it. It's the processes, it's the people involved, it's the philosophy.
What do you hear oftentimes Agile compared to? What's the alternative to Agile? Waterfall. You'll see that was another renaissance fad, whatever you want to call it, that I know very little about, and most people that talk about it know very little about it. But you'll hear, if you're at a tech happy hour and you're like, yeah, we do Agile, and they're like, oh yeah, Waterfall really sucks, man. Like, yeah, but they don't know.
Used it, or not anybody who's used it, but like it sucks.
Yeah, I disagree.
Yep. You'll read about Waterfall and you'll be like, okay, so it's like this is just kind of like a way of ahead of time planning everything out and then moving forward with it. What was a project manager or PJM?
Oh, the project? Yeah, just the one that's like running the developers side basically.
And in the Agile canon, what's the name for that role? It's not necessarily their business title, but what's the name of that role? The person?
Scrum Master.
Exactly. Perfect. Rachel, what's Kanban?
Kanban is kind of it's like the style of like column layout.
Yep. What's the Kanban process? It's Agile minus sprints. Agile minus sprints equals Kanban, basically. Madison, what does LOE stand for?
Level of effort.
Perfect. Awesome, guys. Thank you. That was long and one of the more boring ones. Hopefully we drilled this shit into your head so that if you were ever encountered with this in an interview, you will be ready to know all the words, and hopefully it gives you some more just heart room.
It seems highly likely we're probably going to run into this actually, and it might be the difference between getting hired on or not. It's just
It could be, and it gives you the it gives you like the familiarity, hopefully, of having done it in more than one place.
Yeah.
Because once you guys have done this somewhere else, you'll see like, okay, like I see the connection, I see what's the same, I see what's different. Cool. Well, so today we covered Agile. We covered the Agile philosophy. We covered how it can be applied and how it often is applied in real work settings. We talked about some of the titles that are often involved, and we talked about a lot of the vocabulary. And how to kind of be successful in a conversation that turns into like, how much do you know about Agile? Yeah, and I think we also didn't plan to do any of this. We planned to review multiple of these things. But hey, that's what we got. Engineering 101, Agile. Thanks, guys.